Welcome everybody in this new video. My name is Brian Feldman and I'm a Microsoft Azure and Security MVP. In today's video, I will introduce you to the Azure Resource Manager MCP. And currently, the Azure Resource Manager is public preview. However, I like public previews because we can test new features which Microsoft introduced, because who doesn't love new technology? So most of you know AI, like artificial intelligence, and that you can ask questions about what is Azure, how is this Azure service working. However, the AI model doesn't know your environment. That's where the MCP comes in. MCP stands for the Model Context Protocol, to give your AI model more context about your Azure environment, for example. And this is exactly where the Azure Resource Manager MCP server comes in. So with the Azure Resource Manager MCP, you can, well, for example, in this demo, ask questions using the GitHub Copilot and MCP, which is the Azure Resource Manager MCP, about your Azure environment. And all of this is performed in the backend using Resource Graph queries, which is where the Azure Resource Manager MCP is responsible for. So why will they use this? Well, for example, if I'm curious about the cost from last month for a specific resource group, or for example, how many VMs am I running in my Azure subscription? Are there any insecure configurations on my Azure platform, like OpenRDP for the whole internet? These are just examples, but by combining AI with a model context protocol like Azure Resource Manager, we can just give the AI model knowledge about our environment and also let it perform actions if we want to. And this is exactly what we are going to do today. I prefer to use GitHub Copilot CLI because I'm working in it from day to day. I would like to give the GitHub Copilot CLI more context about my Azure environment, which I will do using the Azure Resource Manager MCP. And then I can ask it questions like I mentioned before, like what are the costs of my Azure environment? What are insecure configurations that I'm running? Can you deploy this bicep template for me? Because I'm a lazy ITer and I don't want to do this manually anymore. So without any further ado, let's go on to the GitHub Copilot CLI and check out how we can use this new MCP and what it can do for us. So currently I've opened up the GitHub Copilot CLI, and to make use of the Azure Resource Manager MCP, we have to add the MCP server. We can do this by performing the following command, /mcp/add. So for the server name, this will be the Azure Resource Manager MCP. Then for the server type, we have to select HTTP, which is option 3. And for the remote server URL, we need to use the mcp.management.azure.com. And after that, you can use the Ctrl+S to save the config. And after that, we can verify that the Azure Resource Manager MCP is connected. So this basically means that we can now work with the MCP and it now has context of our environment. And for the security folks out there, all operations are executed in the context of your signed in user. So if I will delete a resource group using this MCP, then my account will be listed out there. So if you don't like to give away all your permissions to the MCP, then you could create a reader account and then work with that, if that gives you a more confidence feeling. So the first question could be, what are the Azure costs this month for my sponsorship subscription? Subscription. And now it's time to grab some coffee. So the first step, it needs to find the sponsorship subscription. So it will use the AZ account list query in the backend. So yeah, you can do this just by hitting the enter. So the next step for Copilot is to attempting to access the following URL, which is just the management.azure.com. And further in the URL, we can see the Microsoft.cost management, which is perfectly because I asked a question about the cost. And now we just have a cost analysis of our Feldman sponsorship subscription. So the total of my cost on Azure from May 1 to May 15 was about €2, which is not that much. So I'm okay with that. For the next step, I'm changing the working directory because I want to give the GitHub Copilot CLI context of a working directory. And I gave it access to my virtual network manager IPAM bicep folder. So this folder consists of 2 bicep files. One is to deploy an Azure Virtual Network Manager, including 3 IPAM pools. One is the root IPAM pool with a /16, and then 2 other pools which are based for the application landing zones IPAM pool and the platform landing zone IPAM pool. So for example, I can now ask it to deploy these bicep files. So can you deploy these bicep files? Because the Azure Resource Manager MCP is capable of working with ARM templates. And while knowing that, Azure Bicep will be transpiled to ARM on the backend. So it's now reading the main.bicep and the vnet.bicep, and it says I'm looking at two different bicep files with different deployment scopes. One for the resource group level that handles the virtual network manager and the IPAM pools, and another at the subscription level that creates the resource group and deploys the VNet. I need to clarify with the user which approach they want me to use and get the target subscription and resource group details, especially since we used the sponsorship subscription earlier. The first one is the main.bicep, which is the virtual network manager, plus the IPAM pools, which is based on the resource group scope. The second one is only the vnet.bicep, VNet using the existing virtual network manager subscription scope, including the IPAM pools. So it will deploy the VNet based on an IPAM pool, which is part of the virtual network manager. So because the first one is not living there, we cannot just deploy a VNet using an IPAM pool that does not exist, which will cause a failing deployment. So basically for this demo, I want to use both. So it must deploy the virtual network manager first, including the IPAM pools, and then take the vnet.bicep file, deploy the VNet, and also consume side ranges from the IPAM pool. So I will hit enter. So the next question is, what resource group name should I use for the main.bicep file, which is just the virtual network manager and IPAM deployment. And it must also match the vnet.bicep file because it's also referencing the rgcon. So what I did was verifying if the management group CLO exists out there, and the Azure Resource Manager MCP confirmed that for me, so we can proceed with deploying the main.bicep template. And that's because the template file has a dependency on this management group for the virtual network manager scope. So if the management group didn't exist, then the deployment will also fail. So the next step is just deploying the main.bicep files. So it asks me as the user if it's okay to run this command. So I'm confident about that. So I'm going to hit the run command. So the deployment succeeded. Before we go further, because it wants to deploy the vnet.bicep file at the subscription scope, we are going to verify in the Azure portal that the Azure Virtual Network Manager and the associated IPAM pools exist. So now we're in the Azure portal. We can see that the resource group rgcon has been created, including all the resources defined in the bicep file. So we have the Azure Virtual Network Manager and 3 IPAM pools. So we're back in the GitHub Copilot CLI. We can now run the vnet.bicep file because the Virtual Network Manager, including the IPAM pools, exist, and the vnet.bicep relies on the IPAM pool for the application landing zone because this VNet is designed for an application landing zone. So I'm just going to hit the run command, which is basically yes. So now it's exploring the bicep files and deploying the vnet.bicep at the subscription scope. And after waiting like 2 minutes, we can see that both deployments succeeded. The first one we already verified in the Azure portal, which is the Virtual Network Manager, including the IPAM pools. And the second one is the VNet deploy, which is just the vnet.bicep, which consumes the side range from the Virtual Network Manager application IPAM pool. And now it's time to head to the Azure portal to verify that the VNet has been created. So we're back in the Azure portal. As you can see, I have 3 resource groups within this view. However, we need to refresh to verify that the deployment succeeded. So let's hit the refresh button. And it's taking some time. Maybe just refresh my browser session. And boom, the resource group is there. When checking the resource group, we can verify that the virtual network has been created. And from the VNet level, we can see that the address space is based on the application IPAM pool, which is correct. And also from subnet level, we can verify that the application IPAM pool has been used to create this subnet. And as you can see, the Azure Resource Manager MCP is super powerful. Instead asking general questions about Azure to an AI model, you can just work with an AI model on your Azure environment. You decide which kind of permissions you give away to the MCP, and you just let the MCP do the work. If you liked the video, please hit the thumbs up, subscribe below, and I hope I see you next time in a new video. Bye.